Okay. Hi there, guys. This is the free class on values and tone quality. A little bit about myself. I am Elizabeth Floyd, and I am a fine artist. I have been painting for several years. I am represented in multiple galleries along the Eastern Seaboard, and I have been teaching oil painting classes for several years. I think 2017 was the first year that I taught group classes. Prior to that, I was teaching one-on-ones, private lessons. And it is a joy to be here with you guys and to dig into values. So one of the reasons why I'm going to be teaching a class specifically only on values is because I think it's important when you are learning how to paint. It's not even just painting like with oils, but when you're learning to improve the way you are expressing yourself as an artist, it's good to like constrain what you're focusing on to work on learning and mastering that one aspect of your artistic expression at a time, because that way you can, I think it becomes more measurable, and you can also start seeing the results a little bit faster when you constrain what you're focusing on and working on. So with that, we're studying values today, and also inside my painting membership, Painting Flowers with Liz. And values is one of the 3 painting fundamentals. And values, if you want to paint realistically with a sense of 3 dimension in your paintings, you have to get spot on values. Edge quality then is the next like fundamental skill that also helps you with creating a sense of visual depth in your 2-dimensional flat picture plane. And then color, which is one of my favorite aspects of painting, but that is actually kind of like not as important as your values and your edge quality. So with that in mind, we're going to look at values today. And so let's get the slideshow going. So I'm going to share screen. And then let's do slideshow. Here we go. So values and tonal quality in your art. And this is going to be not a short lesson. This is going to be a lesson that we're going to dive in deep and talk about the subject in depth. And then you can go home and immediately start applying exploration to your own work. Okay, so first off, values and tonal quality in your art. Within nature, we have an infinite choice of values. The decisions we make with regard to the value relationships is crucial to creating engaging paintings. This is because in nature, there's a variety of value shifts and it's infinite. However, in painting, we artists must reduce the number of values that we observe and then interpret and put into our painting for 2 reasons. One is that our pigments limit our lightest light and our darkest dark. And then 2, it helps and makes it easier for the viewers to perceive those value shifts in your work, which then the more you can engage the viewer, the more you increase the likelihood of you getting them like enraptured in your work. And as artists, we are creating connection. I think that's the number 1 goal as being an artist, is to figure out ways to create connection with your viewer. And the easier you can find ways to connect with your viewers, the easier it will be to do that. And mastering value is one of those ways. So the simplification, as artists, we use the grayscale or a graduated grayscale. And that is it's a simplification of our value continuum. So you choose to put them into specific steps, and you are organizing your value shifts into these steps in order to create that easier to perceive and easier to express your subject matter. And the first order of business as artists is when we're looking at our subject to paint is to decide how we want to organize our value continuum. found in nature, and then simplify it so it's easier to understand. And so that's like your value gradient. And the easiest that we can start off with is a two value gradient, where our lights automatically are white and our darks are just black. That leaves for, think of something very graphic, a black and white, not a black and white, like a black and white wood block would be, that value gradient is two values: white, the color of paper, and the black ink. And then your next one that you have choice, which is also very easy to choose from, is a 3-value scale, which is you have a light, you have a middle tone, and then you have a black tone. And again, that's very simplified, and it will be perceived as a little bit more flattened than if say we chose to use a classical scale painting gradient. That is one where we provide equal steps within the value gradient. Okay, so our the simplest grayscale that we have available to us is the black and white. It's also called a noten, which means, I think in Japanese, light black or light dark. And then the next one is our 3-value scale: white, middle tone gray, and then black. And then one of the cool things about the values that we see as artists, and when we have we've got the full color value, or the full value spectrum available to us, is that we as artists then get to choose, like, well, how do we want to organize the values we see, and how do we want to convey it? And that is like why we want to organize our values, why we want to simplify and constrain, is because the way we use our values influences the emotions that can also be conveyed in art. So like this Vermeer painting is, Vermeer used a classical scale gradient. Rembrandt was prone to doing these low key paintings, which, you would have a very small percentage of your value gradient would be light, and then more black to your midtones. And then, like, for example, and then like your high key is where you have more lights and more midtone values, but your blacks take up a very small percentage of your painting. And then the Impressionist model, which, it's not always Impressionist, but the Impressionist values is where middle values prevail, where essentially you have maybe a little bit more white, or your lightest lights values, but you would have less dark values, but your middle tones, those midtones, really prevail and take up the majority of the square footage, or the square inch coverage of your canvas. Okay, now light and shade is, we're always having to organize that, and so adding light and shade makes your objects look real. And when you think about, like, you're creating a painting and you have the outline of the object. Now, immediately adding light and shade to that outline starts to give it 3-dimensional form, that sense of form. And form is the look of 3-dimension on a flat surface, but form also is, in art, conveys a sense of weight and visual sense of touch. So you can create 3-dimension, but if you're not rendering it in such a way that you're also giving that sense of visual weight and a sense of touch, it will start to look flat. And to avoid breaking up your main values, you must first establish the local values of your subject first, and then superimpose the sense of order on the shapes by adding the light and shade effects. And what does that mean? That means that, say you have a lemon. A lemon is light in value, but you have right next to it an apple. Well, that lemon object will always have probably lighter values to your red apple, just because of how light the local color of yellow is versus how light or how dark in comparison to yellow. Like, for example, I've got a couple of Post-its right here. And so, like, if you look in the corner, the pink is darker in value to this orange. And so inherently, the values that will be used to, say, render this object that is pink will be different will be slightly darker than the values that you select to render this pale orange one. And what that does is that means that, like, what it means is, like, when you're mixing paint, that means you do not want to be always using the same paint puddles that you used to say, the same, like if you're doing a grayscale painting, you're not going to use the same values that you used for a dark object for a light object, because essentially that will muddy the waters, or it will confuse the viewer, because we rely on the value to provide us with a sense of light and dark. Okay, so one of the things that I want to talk about is that as artists, we have the choice to either use a simplified order of light, which when I first started painting years ago, I was prone to using a 3-value or a 6-value simplified order of light. I try to organize everything to make it just easy, and it works great. So, like, at the beginning, if you're having difficulty with making sure you're getting your values spot on, I suggest you create some exercises where you've simplified your values, your value groupings into less steps, less gradations. And that will help you get better at organizing your value shapes. However, one of the issues with using a simplified order of light is that you do start to lose that sense of visual weight and like sense of touch. It has a tendency to flatten your 3-dimensional objects on your picture plane. But using a simplified order of light is a fantastic way to plan out a composition, to figure out how you want to organize your shapes of value and on your picture plane. Where a classical order of light, especially if you want to paint realistically, is a great way to really think about your objects, because it's easier for you to express a gravitas of form. You have greater variety, so therefore you have more nuance in your expression and what you're painting. And I think that it also, like, I just think of a Vermeer painting, it just helps that painting jump off, that subject matter, just engage the viewer. Now, I want to talk about, like, let's talk about how, when you use a classical order of light and you're thinking about your shape, and you want to and when you're painting, you have halftone, you have lights, halftones, and darks, and the line between your halftones and your darks, halftones shift to your lights, and your darks are your darks. So, like, for example, here in this image right here, you choose where your halftones are, and like, this is a decision where you just make it while you're painting. It's not so much as an artist, we're always in charge of how we're interpreting what we see. And so it is important at the beginning of a painting to make certain decisions of, like, this is where my halftones start and that go off to my lights. And then this is where my shadow shapes, my darks, start and go to darker. And, like, what I want to point out in this, like, when you're painting a 3-dimensional object and you want it to look 3-dimensional, you have what's called a core shadow. And a core shadow is essentially the place, like, so the area, the plane, the area of the object that is directly facing your the light source will be your lightest value. And as it rolls away, it gets darker. However, your darkest dark in your dark areas is your core shadow. And that core shadow is the place where it is perpendicular to your light source. So therefore, it is receiving the least amount of direct light from the light source, and also the least amount of reflected light that bounces off from any of the adjacent surfaces to create a core shadow. So when we look at this 10 value gradient, the core shadow is your number 9, but it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 is your dark halftone. It's your darkest light value, essentially. And then you don't go to 8, which is your light shadow. No, it switches to your core shadow. And then your light shadow is usually the part of the shadow shape that is receiving some reflected light. And your darkest light dark is usually the area where there is absolutely no light whatsoever. It receives no light. So therefore, it's often like your crease of an object in the shadow shape. And so when we're thinking about values, we also always need to be, it's always a good idea to be thinking about how you're separating your lights from your darks, and looking for where that core shadow would go, especially in a round object or a cylinder object. Okay, so with that, I want to talk about some tips. And that is, when you start a painting and view the scene and consider all the values within the value continuum and adapt them into the graduated value scale that you're planning on using, it's important to really think about that your painting is not going to be as dark as you see, nor is it going to get as light as you see. And one of the reasons is, actually, in nature, it's important to notice that, like, what you're observing in nature, you cannot replicate in painting. And one reason is that your whites and your pure colors, your lightest lights that you see in nature always have a little bit of color to them. And so that automatically means that you can't use pure white pigment. You have to shift it in just a little bit in your value scale to make your lightest light will be just a smidge inside of like the whitest white that your paint pigment white is it capable of getting. And then your darkest dark is also going to be smushed in just a little bit as well, because all darks do have some color too. They have a little bit of color temperature to them and everything. So they're not also going to be a pure black. They're going to have a slight color. And in order for our eyes to perceive color in paint, that means the darks have to be lightened just a smidge, and the lights need to be deepened in value just a smidge. And so that means the value continuum that we are working in as artists is just a bit smaller. And so you start a painting looking at that. Look at your lightest light and look at your darkest dark, and realize then that everything else that you go into, it goes in between. And like, I love this painting here is because there isn't really a true black. Is like, for example, the lightest light is probably like right there, but it's not, or even right there, but it's not a pure white. But when we look at the grayscale, we can identify it as the lightest light because we have a comparison. And then our darkest dark is down here, but it's not a pure black either. Another tip is the correctness of value goes hand in hand with how it interacts with its adjacent areas of the painting. If the areas do not harmonize in value relationship, then something is off. And one of the things that I also want to talk about real quick is that oftentimes if you're painting and you keep encountering a muddy area, muddy colors, it is my experience that it's typically not the color that is off. It's most oftentimes it's an error in your value than your color, that you've somehow got your value relationships off. But we think it's the color, but it's probably there's the color either needs to be deepened, darkened in value, or lightened in value to help that, because we, as our eyes have like 4 times the receptors to see value than color. And so with that, we always have to make sure that our value is more spot on than our color accuracy is spot on, which as a colorist, I kind of find that very sad, but it is true. And that's also why having a value plan when you're working on a painting is so helpful too, because then you can, if you're experiencing muddy colors, you can be looking at your values, and then you can decide whether or not your values are on or off. Another tip, the main division between lights and darks usually occurs between the halftones and shadows. By keeping the halftones within the light areas, you give yourself more room to add variation and interest, while also giving the object a sense of mass and volume. This also makes sure that the highlight value is special, and the only place in your object directly opposite to the light source, and is your highlight is the only object that's directly opposite to the light source, and it's the lightest value. So with this painting, your highlights are your lightest values right there. And also on that flower petal and that petunia right there. And all the whites in this bowl are like your midtones. And it helps create volume, but it also makes those highlights special. And then another tip, be careful about making the shadow areas too light. If you focus too much on them when you're painting, your eyes will dilate and adjust, thus making it easier to discern more variation in your shadow shapes. When this happens, focus on the light areas more and flick your eyes back and forth to assess the shadow shapes, but not lingering on those shadow shapes. This will also help in simplifying your shadow shapes, because the more simpler your shadow shapes are, the better the design and organization of your composition is as well. And it also will help you create more visual unity. Shadows play a supporting role in art. They are meant to recede and fall back in contrast to the light areas that are supposed to come forward. Reflected lights in the shadow should never, ever be as light as your dark halftones. So I'm going to scroll back just real quick, and I want to look at this. So like, for example, your reflected, this is what this vertical line is too, is like, for example, your reflected lights and your shadows should never cross this line in your value continuum that separates your lights from your darks. And that just helps you control and make sure that you have, that everything gets organized. So that the viewer can immediately tell that, oh, this is, that form turns, and that's the shadow side, and this is the light side. And it just makes it easier for the viewer to engage in your work. And then my final tip when looking at values is to squint and squint at what you're painting. It's the easiest way to make your eyes work in your favor to discern your value shapes, because we have so many more rods that discern value in our eyes than cones do. And cones to discern color require like full on light. But when you start to squint, you are reducing the amount of light that hits the back of your eyes. And so your cones have to come to the forefront of your perception, your visual perception. And therefore you start to see the big shapes. And like one of the best ways to organize your shapes is to squint. And that's how, and like if you see one shape that you think is a light value, but when you squint at it, it starts to shift into your shadow shape, then that probably is one of your light darks. It would be your light shadow. You're like your number 8 if you're using a 10 scale gradient. I really want to encourage you guys, the best way to get better at understanding your values is to practice drawing or painting with just like white and a dark. So with drawing, you would start with the color of your paper is your white, and then whatever your drawing material is, if you're using charcoal, graphite, or ink. And then when you're painting, choose two colors, white and a dark, an ivory black, a burnt umber, or a raw umber. Like, so for example, this portrait study right here was done with burnt umber and lead white. And in fact, actually, I would encourage you not to use ivory black, because most times when you're painting, you don't use ivory black. You know, your darkest darks in most paintings probably never ever get much darker than your burnt umber. And it helps you learn how to constrain your value scale just a little bit more by starting with a dark that is not as dark as black. And then when you constrain, and the more you work in just a 2-value subject matter, you get better and better at discerning the value shifts. And then when you do return to a full color palette, it's so much easier for you to incorporate and interpret value as well. Thank you so much. And I appreciate you being here. Take care. Bye.